Hello my babes, and welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you are new here. My name is Lori Beth, and today we are going to talk about all of the books that I read in May. And if you were thinking, wow, we are about halfway through June, and we are just now talking about the books you read in May, you are 100% correct in thinking that. I have said it before, and I'll say it again, in 2024, thriving is out and surviving is in. And that's basically where I'm at, most of the time. But with that being said, I'm still very excited to talk to you guys about all of the books that I read in May, even if it is better late than never, as I always like to say. So without further ado, I think we are gonna go ahead and jump right in. The very first book that I read in the month of May was A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab. I have a vlog on this one, which I will link below, where I basically had a mental breakdown over finishing this entire series. Because if you don't know, this is the third and final book in the Darker Shades series by V.E. Schwab, which after finishing it, has quickly moved up to one of my all-time favorite series. So I have my standbys like ACOTAR and Six of Crows, but this is up there with them. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because I have multiple vlogs on this entire series from start to finish. And again, that last vlog where I really did truly have a mental breakdown and I caught myself just sobbing on camera at the very last page of this book. So we're not going to go into like the nitty gritty of it, but this follows our two main characters, Lila and Kel, and they go through all of these adventures to basically rid the London that they live in of some very, very dark magic. So in this story as well, there are parallel Londons where there are different Londons that only very specific types of magicians can travel to. So Red London, White London, Gray London, and there used to be a Black London as well that no longer exists. But within those Londons, lots of adventures ensue, lots of crazy things happen with our characters as well, not only in their development with each other, but also within themselves and kind of like seeing the types of people that they become and the type of magic that they start to envelop. It is a very, very good story. If you like high fantasy, I would put this more towards a high fantasy category. There is a romance subplot, but this is so slow burn that it's not very far forward in the books. So if you don't love romance in your fantasy books, I still think you could enjoy this series without feeling too bothered by it being such a main focus on the characters. And if you are a slow burn girly like I am, then you will enjoy this even more because of that. Because when I say slow burn, I mean literally these characters are developing their feelings for each other over the course of this series. And it really just kind of like perfectly came together with a pretty little bow on top at the end of this book. I have not felt so satisfied in the way a series has ended, I believe, in a very long time. So if you are looking for something kind of more towards that high fantasy, epic fantasy side, and you have not yet picked up the series, I highly, highly recommend. The next book that I read in the month of May was one of my most anticipated releases for the year, and that was Better by Far by Hazel Hayes. If you've been here for a minute and you've watched any of my videos, I have mentioned her first novel, Out of Love, in a couple of different videos that I have done. And it was her debut novel, and I fell in love with her as a writer from that story. So I have been waiting like 2 years for this book to come out, and I was so excited to get my hands on it finally and read it in May. I am going to say I did not love it as much as her first book. So I think I rated this like 3.5 stars, which is good. For me, that's a good rating. But Out of Love was seriously like, it blew me out of the water. However, I still love her writing style. So she writes, these are fiction novels. These are, I would call these contemporary fiction with again, a romance subplot. So they usually kind of involve a relationship or the lack of a relationship in a character. And this one was no different. So we followed two characters that were kind of in this volatile relationship with each other. And they lived together and finally decided to call it quits. And they had to figure out how to run out the lease that they had on their apartment and avoid each other while going through this breakup. So they decide to stay 1 week on, 1 week off at this apartment. But it follows their journey through trying to navigate this breakup while still having some kind of proximity to each other, and also trying to venture out on their own and really kind of stick to their guns this time and follow through on this breakup. Because of course they have broken up time and time again, but have never been able to stay away from each other. So she does write these stories about real life, and that's why I am so drawn to them. I thought this one felt a little drawn out. I don't know a better way to say it. It kind of seemed, and it's not a very long book, it just felt like the story kind of was a little kind of all over the place. I don't know. It's hard to kind of describe. Maybe even though it was like a linear timeline, it didn't feel that way to me, but I still really enjoyed it. And I kind of liked how this story ended. So you have to keep in mind, these are contemporary novels, contemporary fiction novels. They aren't romance novels. So you might not get the ending that you would expect out of a romance book, but that's also why I love it and why I love her as an author, because she's writing real life. And I really did enjoy this one, just not quite as much as I did the first one. However, I do still highly recommend Hazel Hayes as an author in general. So next up, I read Watermoon by Samantha Soto Yambao, and this was an ARC that I received from NetGalley, so thank you so much to NetGalley and the publishers for providing me with an e-copy of this book, and I truly enjoyed it. This was such a magical little story. And in this story, we follow our main character, Hana, who is inheriting her father's pawn shop because he has decided to officially retire. However, this pawn shop is not your average pawn shop. It is magical. And you can't decide to just walk in to the front door. You stumble into it when you are standing in line at a ramen restaurant in the middle of Tokyo. So people end up at this pawn shop kind of by fate, if you will. And in this pawn shop, Hana and her father don't trade trinkets, they trade regrets. So anybody that ends up there most likely has done something in their life that they have huge regrets over, that they think about constantly. And in this pawn shop, you can give up that regret finally and forget that it ever happened. So at the beginning of the story, Hana is introduced to a patron who finds his way to this pawn shop, and he stumbles into the pawn shop upon Hana discovering her father has completely disappeared. The two of them ensue on this adventure to figure out what happened to Hana's father and kind of go on this like wild goose chase, almost uncovering all these little clues along the way that Hana's father has left for her to solve a puzzle for a tragedy that happened early on in her childhood. It was a very interesting story and very magical. The idea that you couldn't even just find this store or this pawn shop to begin with on your own, you only ended up there by fate's doing, I thought was a really cool interpretation. It was not necessarily the best story I've ever read. However, I did like the magic behind it. I thought that the author was very good at using magic at every turn almost. So it felt like a very action-packed book, which I really liked. It made it easy to kind of continue to read. However, I do feel like it started to get a little bit drawn out after a while. Like you were kind of like, okay, how many more things can they do? How many more clues can they find? Or how many more types of magic can they discover before they actually get to the answer and what is going to happen at the end of this book? So I think I rated this about 3.5 stars. Again, if you like really magic heavy stories, this is a great one to get your hands on. And I can't remember when this comes out, but I will put it somewhere on the screen here. And from there, I read The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Katherine Arden. This is a historical fantasy novel, and I didn't realize how much I loved historical and fantasy mixed into one, but let me tell you, it does something for me. And there was a little dab, like a little sprinkling of romance in this book as well, but pretty light on the romance. Like, it was definitely a subplot and not the major plot of this book. So in this story, we followed our main character, Laura, who was a World War I nurse who was discharged from the army after getting injured, and she was kind of back in her hometown, assisting at the local hospital for anybody that was affected by the war that was happening. She soon receives a package from the War Department of her brother's belongings, and she assumes that with these belongings, her brother has perished in battle. However, she quickly starts to realize that something is not right. The way that the items were delivered were not usually how they would come to a family after someone has passed away. So she immediately starts to think that something is up, and she is on a mission to find out what happened to her brother. So with that being said, Laura gets herself back to Belgium, kind of on the front lines, serving as a nurse again in the war. So she starts to uncover even more strange details about her brother and what happened to him. She can't really get a clear answer from anybody. And then she also kind of stumbles upon this other character in the book who is very unnerving and very odd. He almost seems like he doesn't truly exist, almost like he is a ghost figure, but multiple people have had experiences with this character. And it was much darker than I thought it was going to be, but in a very raw and real way for being a fantasy book. And it kind of blended, like, it almost felt a little more magical realism than fantasy because of this character that kind of comes into the story who is very kind of flighty and weird. I also loved the brother-sister aspect of this as well. So what a family would try to do to protect themselves and protect each other. It was very deep and very heartwarming. And if you like a historical setting, especially a war setting, again, with that love from the family members and then a subplot of romance as well, this was like Pearl Harbor the movie, but with that kind of paranormal fantasy aspect behind it. So I believe I rated this one 4 stars, and this was my first book by Catherine Arden, but I really enjoyed her writing style. I thought it was very adult and very poetic at the same time, very easy to read. This was a page turner for me for sure, and I can't wait to read more by this author. And from there, I read Today, Tonight, Tomorrow by Rachel Lynn Solomon, and it was a truly adorable romance book. Rachel Lynn Solomon, in my opinion, is a highly underrated romance author, and for a couple of reasons. She not only writes these romances that are just so cute and quirky, but she has a way of bringing some real life things, like topics and issues into her romances that never really feel too fake or in your face. They are very fluid and kind of just really simply weaved throughout her stories that bring like the sense of empathy to the characters in her books. So in this story, we follow our 2 main characters, Rowan and Neil, and they have just completed their last day of high school, and their high school puts on this super fun scavenger hunt where senior students will go out and try to take pictures of all these clues that are provided in order to win a sum of money that they can take with them to use. Of course, Rowan and Neil have been arch nemesis through their entire high school career, and on this last day during the scavenger hunt, they end up pairing up and kind of combining forces to try to win this game and the prize money. This happens over the course of 24 hours, and they go from being hated enemies to learning a lot about each other and kind of realizing that they missed out on years of being able to have a relationship with each other because they have quite a bit in common that they never let themselves realize before. It was very adorable. I loved the timeline of this story. I don't read a lot of books that happen in like a 24-hour period, and I liked the scavenger hunt aspect of it as well. So this takes place in Seattle, so you're watching these 2 kids run through Seattle, taking pictures of things, learning things about each other, and kind of having their eyes opened. And it just, I don't know, it was very heartwarming and very endearing. I will say that typically the romances I read are about adult characters. It is very clearly stated that these characters are 18. They have just graduated high school, but it is on the younger side, and I was kind of iffy at first about reading a romance about two teenagers where I'm kind of far removed from that part of my life now. I was like, are they going to be annoying? But of course they weren't. They came off very, very smart, very mature for their age, but also very open about the fact that they were learning about relationships as well, because they are still young adult people, technically just becoming adults. They're about to go into the real world. I have read Rachel Lynn Solomon's books in the past. This one stood out in a different way to me. I think it was the timeline of the story. Again, I haven't read many stories that happen in such a short timeline, and I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about that, but I think she did it flawlessly, and it was such a perfectly paced book. This one was a 4-star read for me, and I highly recommend it. Whew! And next up, I read Butter by Asako Yuzuki. I am not going to go into too much detail about this because I just released my vlog on this last week, so I will link that down below as well. But this is a translated novel and a contemporary fiction novel about a journalist who starts to develop a relationship with a woman who is in prison and accused of murdering 3 men. Did she murder these men? We don't know for sure, at least at the start of this book. It is a very interesting human nature study, I would say. We follow a woman who is in a very male-dominated profession, and we see the struggles that she not only deals with from trying to get ahead at work, but also just being a woman in general, especially in this culture. So in the Japanese culture, there are a lot of standards on women as far as aesthetics and beauty and how they look. And of course, because of that, food is also a very big topic as well. There are a lot of trigger warnings for this book, so if you do struggle with things like disordered eating or body image, it is the forefront of this entire book, and again, along with food as well. However, with those heavy topics being discussed so often, we do also see how something like food and food within a culture can help people learn and grow as well. So the book was kind of a give and take about how things are very hard to deal with, but how things can also help you deal with things that are hard to deal with. That was really weird the way I said that. But I thought it was a very interesting story in general. I really liked watching this main character kind of go on this roller coaster. She starts out a little bit meek and mild, and then she kind of goes through these periods of questioning herself and her life and her decisions and her relationships, and kind of coming out the other side of that, having learned so much through this story. With that being said, the book is quite dense. I did say in my vlog that I felt like it needed to be edited down a little bit. It was mostly just from our main character's point of view, and then it kind of does go into some side characters as well, which felt a little jarring to me in the book. So I think there was some editing that needed to be done. However, with that density came incredible descriptions. Like, my mouth was watering at some points in time while reading this because of the descriptions they were going into about these recipes and the food and how it felt like consuming it even. So I did truly enjoy it. Wish it was just slightly shorter. I think probably could have taken like 100 pages out of this book and could have been a higher rating, but I still rated this 3.5 stars. And up next, I read Past, Present, Future by Rachel Lynn Solomon, which is the second book to Today, Tonight, Tomorrow, and I received this as an ARC from NetGalley. So thank you to NetGalley and the publishers for this e-copy. And it was a very interesting journey to continue on with romance characters. I've never done that. I know there are a lot of romance series out there. I've just never really read those before. I'm usually reading like standalone romances. So for me, this was my first experience, kind of going from the characters meeting and developing a relationship to now them being kind of in the throes of a relationship. And I really enjoyed it. I didn't love it quite as much as the first book. So first book, I think I rated 4 stars. This one was like 3.5, but mostly because it was just a different story. So we followed our main characters going from high school into college. They've gone They are in two separate colleges, so now they're dealing with a long-distance relationship, having only been together over the summer between high school and their first year in college. So a very brand new relationship at that. So we follow them into this young adult life for the first time. They're trying to live on their own. They're trying to go to class. They're trying to balance schedules with friends and each other. And I'm not gonna lie, I had a kind of a certain level of anxiety the entire time I was reading this because they were struggling. That's what this book was about. And that's why I ended up rating it a little lower than the first book, just simply because it was really just a book about them struggling. However, there are always satisfying things that come out of watching characters go through struggles. Of course, we know that. That's what we love in character development in books. I don't know. The first book was so fun and so happy, and this one was kind of slap you in the face, real world stress, dealing with like becoming an adult for the first time. And I kind of just had like, I don't know, like butterflies on my stomach the whole time I was reading it. I did really enjoy the way it ended. I don't know if there's going to be any more in this series or not. If there are, I will definitely be reading them because I will say, after reading 2 books and seeing characters go from one stage of their life to the next, you do kind of get connected to them in a certain sense. So I'm not sure if there's plans to release any more in this series or not. I will continue with it. It was very real. It felt very real to me. So if you do enjoy that in a romance book, this would be a good series to kind of get into so you can follow these characters. And again, Rachel Lynn Solomon, I mean, you guys, if you haven't read her romances, just try it. Just pick one up and try it. I promise you won't be disappointed. And finally, I ended the month with Death Valley by Melissa Broder. And what a freaking weird little book this was. I devoured this. I couldn't put it down. And this is the first book I've ever read by Melissa Broder. So if you watch my June TBR video, I go into depth about how I'm kind of just moving into this new season of reading myself. And you can kind of see it in the trend of where I started the month of May with to how I ended the month of May, going from some like heavy fantasy into more like romance and then literary fiction, which is what this book was. And kind of like that really weird girl fiction is what I like to call it, where we follow some of these female characters and stories that are a little bit unhinged, a little bit unreliable, and I am just eating it up. This story was kind of a blend of so many different things for me. It was funny, but it was heavy. It was dark and twisted a little bit at some points, but then it would like kind of come back around and make you laugh again. And we follow a main character who has kind of just like gone out into the desert to gather her thoughts and kind of compose herself a little bit because she's dealing with some very heavy family issues. So her father is in the hospital. He's kind of in and out of consciousness. Her husband has a chronic illness for years now, and they can't figure out exactly what is wrong with him. So she's always kind of like in the back of her mind thinking about her husband and his health, and then her father becoming ill on top of it has kind of made her implode a little bit. So she's kind of taking this time to go out and hike in the desert and just kind of get away from everything that has become a dark cloud over her. And along the way, she just kind of goes on this very existential journey. And things start happening to her. Like there's this scene with a cactus in this book that gives it almost like this magical realism, fever dream type narrative, and you just truly get sucked into the story and lost within what is going to happen to this character. This is not a light, fluffy book. It's not a romance where you're going to get necessarily a happy ending, and I kind of loved it for that even more. It made this character feel so raw and so unapologetic, and I truly love reading characters like that sometimes. I don't know, the book was just kind of wonky and weird, and I can't describe it any other way. This was the first book that I have read by Melissa Broder. I know that she has a couple of other very popular stories, and after reading this, I truly can't wait to buy everything that she has written. I felt that her writing was very real and kind of poignant at the same time. I don't know, she had like this really good balance of making you laugh, but also kind of like slapping you in the face with some reality. And I truly enjoy writing like that, especially these days as I'm kind of going into my fiction era. And again, those female characters that are very unapologetic. They are kind of like, I'm a little messed up and I'm just doing my best. Again, I'll say it. Thriving is out, surviving is in, and that's what this entire story was for me. If you have not read this one and you have thought about maybe reading some of Melissa Broder's work, I can at least highly recommend this story. Again, I will come back to you after I have read any more of her books. Well, there you have it. That is all of the books that I read in the month of May. That was 8 books total, I believe, and a pretty decent reading month for me. Kind of a wild reading month, if I do say so myself. Again, you saw a trend happening. You could see me going through my season change in the middle of this month. We were starting with some epic high fantasy and kind of slowly moving our way over to the fiction side of things. I would love to know if you have read any of these books that we talked about in today's video, or is there a book you think I would like based on the books that we talked about today? Drop that in a comment below. Let a girl know. I'm here for the recs. I'm always here for the recs. As always, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button because it always helps a girl out. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any of my other upcoming videos, like my TBR videos and my vlogs that I release on a weekly basis, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. As always, it has been an absolute blast, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next one.